Hey guys, Jake from 8020 Media here. Today we're talking about performance modifications and upgrades for GM's 2.7 liter turbocharged inline 4 known as the L3B. Recently, I did a video talking about problems and shortcomings of the 2.7 liter engine, and while we talked about a couple concerns from a reliability and problem standpoint, one thing that actually is fantastic about this engine is its performance potential, and that's because it comes from the factory with a turbocharger. You might be feeling bad that you got the inline 4 4-cylinder engine instead of a bigger V8, but because we have a turbocharger here, with just a handful of bolt-on modifications, we can add about 100 wheel horsepower and upwards of 100 to 120 wheel torque to these engines with just 3 basic bolt-on modifications. So in this video, I'm gonna go ahead and talk about what those modifications are. We'll talk a little bit about the power levels that you're gonna be able to expect from each of those modifications, and then I'll go ahead and wrap up talking about other modifications that will be good in the future once we get a little bit more tuning and performance support. First off, the number of modifications here is small because there just isn't a whole lot of aftermarket support yet. Typically, it takes 5+ years for engines to really start getting real support from a tuning and aftermarket standpoint, and that's because a lot of these newer engines, they still have warranty on them. People aren't modifying them like they do once the trucks get a little bit older, and it takes a lot of time for companies to be able to figure out how to actually get into the computers on these vehicles, especially in today's day and age where the computer systems are so complex, and GM and all these other companies are putting a lot of technology in them to prevent people like us from being able to crack into them and make changes. So things are limited right now, but hopefully more performance support is going to open up once people start to realize that these engines can actually do some pretty good things from a performance standpoint. We can look comparatively against the 2.7 liter EcoBoost that's used in the F-150, where there's a ton of aftermarket support for those engines now. They've just been out a little bit longer. So with that being said, from a performance standpoint on these engines, there really isn't anyone that's fully pushing these things to the limit to be able to tell you, here's what the upper bounds of this engine are. I will tell you though, in 2022, there were a number of changes that were made to this engine, doing a lot of strengthening around the internals and the block and other parts of the engine. But with the list of modifications that we're talking about here that are just basic bolt-on modifications, you can do these on a 2019 to 2021 model, and you're going to be well within the safe power limits of the engine. And so no concerns over catastrophic damage or the internals not being able to handle an extra 100 wheel horsepower from the modifications on this list. But I can't exactly tell you guys what the upper bounds of the engine are yet because we're still working on finding that out. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our 3 modifications here. The first one is going to be tuning. Tuning is where all of your big power gains are going to come from. Because this is a turbocharged engine, it's very easy to just turn up the amount of boost that the turbo is producing and see big power gains from that. There's not a whole lot of true tuning solutions out there for these engines, but there are a number of good piggyback tuning options, and piggyback tunes are great at this stage because you can remove them and they'll be completely undetectable. So if you have warranty or you're concerned from that standpoint, you can remove these devices. It just takes a little bit of uninstall process because they wire directly into the ECU. But a good option on the market is Berger Motorsport's JB4 piggyback tuner. The JB4 can add up to 85 wheel horsepower and up to 120 wheel torque, basic plug and play gains. So tuning is going to be the #1 modification where your big power gains are going to come from. The next 2 modifications on this list are really going to be there to help support tuning and to provide enough airflow into the engine and airflow out of the engine once we have the boost pressures turned up on the turbocharger. And so that second modification is going to be a cold air intake or an upgraded performance intake. With an upgraded intake, we can improve airflow by 20, 30, 40% to the turbocharger. That helps support the turbocharger. It helps it spool faster, taking some stress off of it and helping it achieve those higher boost pressures that we now have with tuning. On a completely stock truck, you're likely going to see somewhere around maybe 5 to 8 wheel horsepower gains from just an intake alone. But when we combine that with a tuning solution, we can get upwards of 10 to 15 wheel horsepower and wheel torque. So ultimately, there are some restrictions on the factory intake. Opening that up is going to help bring more airflow in there. It's going to help support the tuning, and it's going to help give you some solid power gains out of it as well. And then the third component to this is an exhaust system, which helps get the air out of the engine more quickly. When we speak about performance and power in general, the most important things are getting air to the engine and getting air out of the engine. The more quickly you can do that, the more power and the more performance you'll get. So with an exhaust system, the only option on the market right now is going to be a catback exhaust system. I will say typically on turbocharged vehicles, the best part of the exhaust to upgrade is going to be the downpipe, which usually has the catalytic converter in it. So you can upgrade to a high flow downpipe or a catless downpipe, and that's going to have the biggest impact because that's what directly bolts up to the turbocharger. And so reducing back pressure right near the turbocharger helps it spool faster, take a lot of stress off of the turbocharger, which is going to give you lower engine temperatures as well. However, downpipes are not available yet for the 2.7 liter. So the best thing that we have is a catback exhaust system. While the catback is going to be the least important part, we still can reduce some exhaust back pressure by upgrading the catback exhaust. That's going to be a good thing to do to help air get out of the engine more quickly, reduce back pressure, which takes a little bit of stress off of the turbocharger and gives you lower exhaust gas temperatures and engine temperatures. So while it's not as ideal as a downpipe, it's still a good upgrade. You'll likely see maybe 5 to 8 wheel horsepower power gains from it. So it's not huge from a power standpoint, but it is good from reliability to reduce that back pressure and help the turbo out a little bit more as well. So those are the 3 best modifications that are available right now. What I'd be keeping my eye on for is an upgraded downpipe, because an upgraded downpipe will be probably the second best modification on these engines once one of them is available. That's where you're going to be able to get probably 15 to 20 wheel horsepower out of just that pipe by removing the catalytic converter or going with the high flow catalytic converter to reduce exhaust back pressure a lot more significantly than you can do with a catback exhaust system. And then another thing that I'd keep an eye out for at some point is intercooler upgrades. I would say on a relatively stock with just a basic tune, intake, and exhaust, an intercooler might not be a huge upgrade unless you're running aggressive tuning, but an intercooler will be a great reliability modification. And in my opinion, especially once we talk about tuning and performance upgrades, doing whatever you can for reliability is a huge thing. And so intercooler upgrades aren't out quite yet, but I imagine in the next year or two, we'll start seeing some options for upgraded intercoolers. And at that point, that's going to be one of the best performance upgrades that you can do to help improve reliability by lowering engine temperatures, exhaust gas temperatures, especially for people that do a lot of towing with their 2.7 liters. So anyways, guys, that covers it for our list of modifications. We've got tuning, an intake, and an exhaust. And then in the future, stay tuned and keep an eye out for downpipe upgrades as well as intercooler upgrades. Ultimately, yes, these are small inline 4 engines, but they come with pretty solid power levels from the factory. And with just a couple bolt-on modifications, we can actually get these things producing more power than the 5.3 liter V8 can in completely stock form. And yes, you can do modifications and upgrades to those, but it's a lot harder to get power out of a naturally aspirated V8 than it is out of a turbocharged application. So you might be saying, oh man, I wish I got the V8, but don't worry, because these 2.7 liters can actually produce some pretty significant power with a couple basic upgrades. Anyways, guys, I hope you appreciate this video. If you did, click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for all the future content that we have coming on GM's 2.7 turbo engine.